Hey, Biology 11. Well, let's get trucking on and moving on with Chapter 17, the fossil record. This chapter is all about the age of the Earth and the age of fossils. And if we find them at various levels in the Earth, in these layers, how we figure out how old those fossils might be. And that helps us to link sort of the larger story of the evolution of critters on our planet. This is a very interesting slide, this one here, and it reminds me of Jurassic Park, the movie, where in the movie they found not a scorpion, which had been trapped in amber, but they had found a little mosquito. And in the mosquito, they were all excited because in the movie, they found some intact dinosaur DNA, and they used that to bring back the T-Rex and the Velociraptor and all sorts of things like that. This is essentially pitch, which poured over top of this poor critter, entombing it, and making sort of one of the rarest fossils you'll ever find, which is an intact fossil of a critter, in this case a scorpion. It hasn't decayed because it's not exposed to the air. There's nothing to break it down, and inside you actually have the cast of the organism plus the organism itself. That's quite rare. In fact, most of the time when we look at fossils, all that we really find are imprints of what was left behind. We'll talk about fossilization in this tutorial. So what's the fossil record? It's a giant pile, if you will, of evidence that we've dug out of the ground all over the world of organisms from all over the planet. And as you look at it across all the continents, across all the countries, you see an interesting tale of what you dig up, an interesting tale of what came before and how it compares to critters we have now. They're basically, fossils are like time capsules, and they allow us to go back and see how the Earth used to be. It's all about evidence. In science, you must prove it. And evidence helps to support your hypotheses. And as you systematically go about proving or disproving hypotheses, you build towards a larger theory. For example, theories like continental drift, theories of evolution. Theories aren't just hunches. They're based on evidence. And that evidence has to stand up to scrutiny. Organisms have been changing quite substantially over time. And what do we find in the fossil record? Well, we find their bones. Poor critter left behind here. These aren't the actual bones. It's very important to note that most of the time, virtually all of the time, what you're finding, when the critter dies, it's buried, and when it's buried, its bones sort of form a mold, and the rock and the sediment, as they build up over top of the organism's bones, they form an imprint, a cast, if you will, and that leaves behind information about what that organism was like. Most of the body decays. It's been buried down deep. There's processes of erosion. There's water trickles in and out of remnant fossils. So we don't often get a really great cast. But in this case, we've gotten some doozies. And quite often what we can do, based on the bones that we see, we know what the other ones should look like. So we can fill in some of these fossils and get a better idea. The fossil record tells us there's been a heck of a lot on this planet before us. It's kind of interesting. I'd like to see where the 99% came from in this figure. 99% of species that have lived on the Earth are extinct. Gone. History. Well, 65 million years ago, when the asteroid hit the planet down in the Yucatan Peninsula, it created quite an impact. Let's pop out for a sec. I'm going to go to Google Earth, and let's take a look at that Yucatan Peninsula. For those of you who've been to the Yucatan, it's down in Mexico. Alright, so we'll pop down to good old Google Earth. And I visited this spot quite recently. I think it was on the browser. So Yucatan, Yucatan Peninsula. Okay, so let's fly over in Google Earth down to Mexico. Here we go. Zooming in. There we go. And I'll just go in manually. So what happened was this is the Yucatan Peninsula here, and a peninsula is a body of water covered on three sides. And right down here, I'll zoom in on the region. What happened is a rather large asteroid hit in this region right about here, and it hit so hard, you can imagine, any water it came in contact with, it flash boiled. Okay, let's go a little bit closer. You're getting an idea of where I'm talking about now. It flash boiled the water, cast a tremendous amount of sediment into the air, and it marked the difference between the Cenozoic and Mesozoic eras. So this impact was 65 million years ago, and there's still a scar down the Yucatan Peninsula, and sonar shows the hole. In fact, it hit so hard it almost broke the continental plate. That would cause an effect almost like a nuclear winter. Just an unbelievable impact. 65 million years later, we've managed to recover. It was quite something, and reptiles really didn't survive this very well. Now, as we learn more about them, we're finding out about some of their adaptations. We think maybe a few might have been able to heat their bodies, but by and large, they were not able to adapt to this tremendous sort of overnight nuclear winter. The reptiles that did survive, we found that crocodiles obviously survived. They kept going, and virtually the reptiles just falls off the planet. It's just gone, as you'll see in a later lecture. But crocodiles and burrowing critters like that, even the first mammals as they were showing up, seemed to be much more hardy, much more able to survive. So let's go back to this presentation. You and I are what we describe as extant. That means that we are living, currently living. That's a good thing. So we're in the extant category right now. Of course, that can all change with a bad cosmic incident. The 99% that they're referring to here is they're saying there's been a lot before us, and we're sort of all that remains now. So we'll take it with a grain of salt that way. It's important to talk about how fossils form. So I'm going to pop out to the web. You need to know about the three rock types, because fossils form in sedimentary rock. Okay, so I'm sort of thinking, well, what are the other two? So well, one of the forms is igneous rock. Now, igneous means born of fire. Let's go to some images of it. The kind of rock you would expect to come out of a volcano. It can be really incident. I always think of Hawaii when I'm looking at this because it's so volcanically active. Igneous rock that takes a long time to cool, or a greater amount of time to cool, will form almost sort of this porous sort of structure that you're seeing here. In fact, some of this can float because it's lower density than the water it displaces when it's hanging out on it. Obsidian is igneous rock. Let's say this came out of a volcanic, a volcano, and cooled very quickly. Very few crystals form, and it's more like glass. It's fabulous. We see all the different types here. Pretty amazing when you look at this. And I always say it's better to let a geologist take this on. But igneous rock, there's not a chance it could harbor a fossil, because the heating process would just destroy any fossil contained inside of the rock. As rock goes down into the earth, as it subducts, as the plates, some of the plates hit each other, and as they bend down, when that rock melts and comes back up to the surface as molten material, you can't expect a fossil to make it. Not sedimentary rock, I meant to say metamorphic. There we go. Metamorphic rock is rock that's formed by heat and pressure. And some of my favorite metamorphic rock is what makes up, granite tabletops. Let's find some nice, there we go, some nice granite. Metamorphic rock formed of heat and pressure. I even think of diamonds in terms of this. That heat and that pressure, you can't expect a fossil to survive that process. Here's Mr. Happy Metamorphic Rock for some reason. It makes excellent building material, and you'll see some of the more common kinds of metamorphic rock, and they're looking at gneiss and quartzite, marble, etc. And we've seen this. In fact, living in British Columbia, we're quite familiar with this type of rock. You can't expect it to contain fossils, it just gets destroyed. However, sedimentary rock is created through the deposit of sediments, or the buildup of layers. So sedimentary rock, literally meaning layered, we'll pop out to that, is laid down over time, and well, there we go. That's right out of our PowerPoint presentation that I was looking at here. And it leaves behind a story. We know that the rocks nearest the surface generally tend to be youngest, and the ones that are down further, they tend to be the older rocks. Get a chance, pop out to Google and take a look through all the various sedimentary rocks. But what you'll see is that sedimentary rock leaves behind a story, and in many cases you'll see that some things are trapped in it, trace fossils, or even more elaborate fossils for that matter. So most fossils form in sedimentary rock, and as long as the exposure and the weathering and the breakdown isn't too great, the fossils should remain quite well preserved down deep in the earth. When it gets down too far, we start to look at metamorphic processes, all that heat and that pressure down deep in the earth where we form diamonds. It's neat when you look at deltas and areas where a lot of silt and clay build up. Pop up for a sec. We'll look at a river delta. Being from BC, there's a famous one, the Fraser River Delta. Let's see if we can pop out a nice image here. Some nice ones there, but I think I can go straight to it and just pick my favorite. Oh, there's one. That's exactly what I wanted to show you. That material that you're looking at there is full of silt and fine particles from not only the land, but from erosion as the water sort of carves its way along, and it deposits all this sediment as it leads out to the ocean. Well, you got to remember that a lot gets carried downstream, and in areas like this, so much can be carried downstream that it can actually be buried in these regions, and later we come along and we dig them up and find all kinds of neat stuff there. So silt, clay, things like that, great for fossils. Now the region, we have to be careful here. If you want to find fossils in it, it can't have a ton of erosion or weathering processes, because that tends to, well, obviously destroy fossil content. So here's our poor little fish, poor little guy. So the fish dies, settles to the bottom, and little particles of rock and clay, etc., start to cover it up over time. So our friend here gets entombed and settles down to the bottom. If it's not consumed by, say, a detritus feeder, a crab, things like that, it's gone. It's history. And here's just the burial process. And our poor little critter, it gets buried, and a lot of the biological parts break down right away, the skin and some of the softer parts, the muscle, etc. But what remains behind is sturdy enough to be built upon, and everything builds around it. And what we find is we get an imprint, and later on we could dig this up, and lo and behold, we have a fossil. It tells us about this critter. For example, it's a chordate. There's a lot to be learned from what we're seeing right here. It has supportive structure up its back. Now, specifically, this would be a vertebrate. We know that it had a head structure. Fairly interesting jaw structure here. It's definitely an ancestor to our modern fishes. So we look at all of its structures very carefully, right down to the fins and the lobes of the fins above, because we want to see how the structures have changed, and we just start to compare it to modern day examples of fish. And we see some oddities, and we see some similarities, and they sort of tell us a story of how things are progressing. How old would we know that fossil to be? Like, really, how can you tell? Well, I always talk about the locker concept, relative dating. Relative dating is really a way of saying, well, how deep in the earth, how deep is the fossil compared to others? So if I find a fossil that's relatively shallow, maybe it's a few thousand years old, if it's on the top, well, relative to a fossil I found much further down, I do have a sense of how old one thing is compared to another. I can't say absolutely, but I can say, well, I think you have to be very careful with this. My hypothesis is that that one is younger based on its relative position in the rock strata layers. However, we could do something a little bit more, well, let's just say with a bit more panache, called radioactive dating. Now, radioactive dating, that changes the whole equation because we can age not so much the material. There's not much. You'd be lucky to have any material left behind of a fish or anything like that. Like occasionally, there is some material discovered of ancient organisms, some frozen mastodon remnants in the Arctic. That's extremely rare to find something like that. And we'd get very excited if we found something like dental pulp in a tooth because that leads to DNA. And once we have DNA, we can literally look at the genetics of the organism and compare it to modern critters. We don't see those kind of intact fossils where it's actually biological material. Not very often. So what we find is the imprint of a bone or a hand or a fin or a plant, a leaf, whatever, and then we just age the rock. And we figure out the age. Absolutely. So what we do is we age the rock. And that should tell us, if this is the age of the layer in general, how old would the fossil be in it? Well, the fossil should be as old as the layer is. That's the trick. So here's a visual of relative dating. And relative dating is it's just like I said, about placement. So we'll zoom in here for a sec. And based on what we're seeing here, this is sort of an anthropologist's dream. I get tired of this continually yellow highlighter color. Let's go with an orange. Have to fade it out. A little stronger. There we go. If we find pottery and the remnants of an ancient hearth, right, fireplace, near the top, well, we know these were laid down fairly recently. Looks like there was an establishment here. We see brickwork. Go down a little bit further and we find some of the more ancestral things. We find a skull down here. Some stonework, which looks like it was laid down at a much earlier time. Ancestral material down here. So our youngest material, relative age, this should be younger. And this should be older. I mean, we're seeing bricks here, for example. We're seeing stonework down here. And that's just they're just giving you an example, but you get the idea. As we unearth aspects of ancient Rome, we're finding tools and implements as Rome was built up upon itself. We're finding more and more out about Rome as we begin to uncover it. Relative dating, we can look at some of these critters. There we go. We could look at something like this little critter here, trilobite. Closest thing you'd see now would be some of our ancient crabs. Very, very old. This is what we call an index fossil. That'll come up. Your horseshoe crab, or not, your horseshoe crab, for example, would be about as closely related to this as anything I could think of. Look down a little further into layers and we find, let's just zoom out a little bit so we can see the whole thing. There we go. We see that in similar layers, in similar regions, that animals took hold around the same time. We're finding snails in this region, a little more youthful, changing a little bit. We can find our trilobite with all of its exceptional segmentation, a little younger, a little higher up. And interesting, as the shells become more and more complex, our shelled organisms change and we find all of these. Point is, in a relative order, these should be some of our youngest fossils, and our oldest would be found a lot deeper. These rock strata can be separated by vast geographic expanses. We could be looking at rock strata of regions that could be on separate continents, but at one time when the continents were together, it would have been one landmass connected. Or similarly, we could look at what is underwater, but at one time was above water. The strata is the strata; it's still there. If we go to the Antarctic, it wasn't always covered by ice. There are fossils that we're finding there which suggest a tropical existence, because Antarctica at one point was much closer to the equator and not covered with ice, needless to say, than it is now. These are all clues about our existence. Our trilobite's really interesting because it's an index fossil. By an index fossil, it's just one that we say is widely recognized. We find trilobites everywhere. If you go to the Burgess Shales in British Columbia, you'll see trilobites. And trilobites are interesting because they show us a critter with hard parts, like an arthropod. So we sort of think of insects and crustaceans, lobsters. Well, we've got lobsters, shrimp, crab, things like that. And when we see the segmentation, it gives us an idea of how long segmentation has been around. And we see segmentation like this in arthropods. Arthropods are a very big group. It's anything really which has jointed limbs. So our insects would fit into this. So index fossils, like the trilobite, tell us that this was a highly successful organism that you could find all over the world. And like the horseshoe crab, it would have been hanging around in the water, probably not too deep, but it had a vast geographic range. And if we find it all over the world, then we know, well, the conditions in those areas must have been fairly similar. Okay, radioactive dating. This is a very interesting concept. If in Science 10 you had a chance to study radioactivity, you'll learn that there's these things called isotopes. And I like to summarize it by simplifying the idea of an isotope. It's something which has the same atomic number, but has a different atomic weight. So for example, carbon is carbon, but its atomic weight, normally its atomic weight is 12, but there is a form of carbon which is carbon-14. Now that's heavier. Reason why, if you remember, the atomic mass of something is determined by the number of protons it has and by the number of neutrons it contains. Each one is considered to have approximately one atomic mass unit. When we look at carbon, two forms, carbon-14 has a few extra neutrons. We'll just keep it that simple. Carbon-14 is a radioactive version of carbon, and it undergoes a form of radioactive decay. The nucleus is unstable, and it turns into a different element as it emits particles. So it's emitting radiation. As it's emitting radiation, its nucleus is actually unstable, and it's becoming a different atomic number. It'll have a different number of protons in the nucleus as that nucleus degrades. So based on this, we see radioactivity, and if you hold a Geiger counter over top of a radioactive material, you'll hear it clicking, and in a way, what you're hearing is the decay of the nuclei. And I always thought they were it almost sounded like they were popping like little popcorn kernels. And you can hear that sort of click, click, click sound. I've got a neat little demo for you on radioactive dating, which talks specifically about how carbon degrades. Carbon degrades at a very constant rate. It's a concept of a half-life. If something along the lines of carbon-14 degrades, we know how long it takes. So before the video starts, what I do want to show you, and I'll switch to, well, maybe not red, switch to brown, that's good enough. There's a point at which half of your initial carbon is gone, and you're left with the sort of nitrogen remnants. On a graph, we can draw over and up. At this point, when we see half the material is gone, we say that one half-life, the first half-life, has gone by. And we look at the time, reading directly off a graph, depending on the material. There's different materials we can look at for the radioactivity that have different uses. There's forms of uranium, which will take billions of years to decay. Carbon-14 has about a 6,000 year half-life. So after 6,000 years, half of the material will be gone. If we continue this process and we go to the second half-life, we'll only have a quarter of the material remaining. Third half-life, you see this begins to level off. 1/8. And by the time you get to 1/16, there is really, let's see, actually hard to draw, but there we go. There's very little of the material left. When you consider carbon-14 after 4 half-lives, let's say it's 6,000 years, you see that there's very little material left. But if we did age something and we found, let's say, the proportion of carbon-14 remaining was about a 1/16, we would know that approximately 24,000 years had gone by if we were dating carbon-14 in the sample. Okay, let's see this pitched in an animation, which I think will sort of help to clarify this. So I'll just pop out of this for a moment. There we go. And I have it all queued up, so I'm going to go quiet for a bit and enjoy this alongside you.
Carbon exists as both carbon-12 and a radioactive isotope, carbon-14. Carbon-14 chemically behaves like all other carbon isotopes, so living organisms ingest and excrete it, and it becomes part of their living cells. The ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere is stable, as is the ratio of the two isotopes in all living things, so long as the organism is living. When an organism dies, however, its uptake of all forms of carbon stops. The carbon-12 in the parts of the organism that remain, such as bones, remains stable. The carbon-14 in these parts, however, gradually decays. As time elapses since the organism took in carbon-14, the total mass of carbon-14 that remains keeps decreasing. In 5,715 years, half the carbon-14 in a sample will have decayed or changed into some other form. After another 5,715 years, half of what was left will have decayed, leaving just a quarter of the original amount, and so forth. Carbon-14 dating methods can be used for organic materials less than 50,000 years old. They are typically not used for relatively modern samples. Samples as small as 100 milligrams can be tested, with the precision of dating typically being within a century for samples over 25,000 years old.
Okay, so not a bad little example. And I'll link up this animation on the website. It's a very good one. So let's reflect back here. Here we go. Okay. So we've seen the concept of half-life applied. And by half-life, that means only half the material remains. The second half-life, a half of a half is a quarter. And at the third half-life, you have an eighth. And at the fourth half-life, you have a 16th, so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, look on the side of the graph here, you notice that what we're looking at is we're looking at potassium 40. Potassium 40 has a tremendously long half-life. So this particular isotope is in terms of billions of years. Well, that's quite useful, especially for aging things on our planet, because if we think that our planet is approximately 4.5 billion years, we can interpolate, we call it that, we can interpolate that off the graph. Looks like about a 16th. Looks like about the fourth half-life right there. That's old enough to age the planet. So if you find some potassium 40 in some of the original rocks on the Earth, or if you find something fell to Earth like a meteor, and you find meteorite, sorry, once it hits the Earth, once you find a bit of this in the meteorite, you can age it and look at a sample and see, well, how much potassium 40 remains. All sorts of things. Uranium decaying into lead. There's a whole table of these ones we can access. Now, I go over this more in class. It's not something that we like talk about in the course extensively. Geological time, and it's such a vast amount of time when you consider it. 4.5 billion years. How do you organize that in a sort of a geological librarian's way? How do you do that? We've got interesting naming conventions, eras, periods, epochs. It's not something that would come up in the course. Very much geology topic, but I do want to show a few basic ones. This would be it. I'll zero in on a few things. The scale along this side, switch to purple, this right here, at this point we're looking at millions of years. And here's the formation of the planet down here in what we call the Hadean era, in Precambrian time, very, very ancient, 4.5 billion years ago. If we zoom in, let's go right to the top, we're way up here in the Cenozoic era. Well, that's not very much. We're in this little time frame right here. And right here, where I'm drawing an X, 65 million years ago, right there at the border, is when the Yucatan Peninsula suffered that impact, and the age of the monsters, or the age of the reptile, dinosaurs, passed. Go back a little further, there were other major turning points. Paleozoic. Before the reptiles, you could say it was the age of the amphibians, when the earth was much more swamp-like and wet. During the age of the reptiles, it was much hotter, a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, very, very warm planet. Not, you wouldn't be seeing the ice caps that you would see now. In the Cenozoic era, this is where we've encountered a major ice age, when the earth wobbled on its axis and we turned away from the sun. Vast, vast periods of time. Each one of these eras can be broken down into periods. So the Cenozoic, if you want to zoom in on it, right now we're in the Quaternary, whereas previously was the Tertiary. If you go to the Mesozoic, here we all see Jurassic Park, right about here. Interestingly enough, if you think 65 million years ago, right here, well, we guess we would have called it Cretaceous Park around that time, because the dinosaurs that were existing were in that era. And the Triassic, you see it coming before those two, but that's all in the Mesozoic era. And as we go back to the Paleozoic era, all sorts of things happen in this time frame. A lot, too many to go over, but I'd like to draw a little bullseye around this time when you see fish. The first fish begin to evolve. So I think of these time frames here as the age of the fish, and just tremendous diversity. But one thing I do want to point out, we haven't found any skeletons of humans before right about here. Let's draw a bullseye. Science always marches forward with this, but we're finding human skeletons. This is 50 million years right here, and we're not really even finding them until, let's just draw an approximate, at this point. Upwards of maybe 4 to 6 million years ago, depending on experts' estimates. So when I look at this and I see the Cretaceous and the Jurassic, and I see a movie on Friday nights and I see the caveman being carried away in the mouth of the pterodactyl, unless he invented a caveman time machine and went back and jumped into the mouth of the pterodactyl, no, there weren't dinosaurs and humans at the same time. And the evidence of that is we don't find humanoid type skeletons down in the rock layer where we find the dinosaur skeletons. It just doesn't happen. This is a tremendous graph. It's, in a way, I sort of look at this and think, oh, it's almost like the stock market. But this is the ups and downs, I guess, in a stock market way, of extinctions and diversity. So the extinction rate has had some exceptional spikes in history. And I remember my professors talking about this. Just a monstrous extinction rate there. And there's a great, what we call the Great Permian Crash right here. We're still not entirely certain what caused some of these. Perhaps it was volcanic activity acidifying the oceans, but I'll let experts speak to that. And there was a great Cretaceous crash right about here. And the asteroid impact, well, we kind of know it had a fair amount to do with that, because the age of the monsters came to an end. Interestingly enough, what we can conclude is that over time, even though we've had extinctions, right here, the number of taxonomic families has increased. So what remains has diversified and become different. And you can see that red line carrying on, showing that evolution is leading to all sorts of new experiments and new body types. Some survive, some don't. It's sort of a grand tree of life, and it keeps moving onwards, and some of the limbs go are dead ends, and others, well, it's like a branch that radiates off into many little sub-branches. And that's what's going on with the taxonomic families. At this point, I'll stop right about here because this is a summary of the Earth's geological timescale. I've given this out in class. If you'd like to take a look over it, I invite you to try to memorize all of it. I think I memorized it once upon a yesteryear, and it was the kind of thing that would just fall right out of my skull. It's a tremendous amount of material to memorize. So at this point, ladies and gentlemen, 17.1, we'll be heading off into 17.2, activities such as the evolution of Barbalus, a whole bunch of testing. But I invite you to remember to relax, have a good time, enjoy biology, and particularly important, read. I know the book is thick, but it's because it's got so much darn information. Have a good one.